April 30th, 1945. Deep beneath the shattered streets of Berlin, the final archives of Adolf Hitler are fed into the flames. Files vanish in smoke, diaries, coded reports, correspondence, destroyed with the same cold precision that had once ordered armies across continents. Above ground, the capital of the Reich is collapsing. Soviet shells pound the city, flames lick the night sky, and the once mighty empire is reduced to rubble and whispers. Hitler's last command is clear: erase every trace, leave nothing for history to find. But history is never so obedient. Decades later, in the quiet offices of post-war Europe, French Commandant Raymond Rose stumbles upon a cache of documents long buried in Soviet archives. Among them, fragments of Eva Braun's last letters, drafts of Hitler's political will, and eyewitness testimonies that had been locked away from the world. Pages yellowed by time, but heavy with secrets. These were the missing pieces of the final puzzle. The discovery answered questions the world had asked for generations. What truly happened in the bunker during those final days? What was the atmosphere like among Hitler's inner circle? The exhaustion, the paranoia, the betrayals? And when did Adolf Hitler decide that his destiny would not be escape, but death? This is not merely the story of a dictator's end. It is the descent of a regime into its own abyss, told through the letters, wills, and whispered voices of those trapped beneath the Reich Chancellery. This is Hitler's last secrets and the final days in the Führerbunker.
By April 1945, Berlin was no longer a city, it was a carcass. The heart of Hitler's empire had become a wasteland of fire and stone, scarred by years of Allied bombing and now under the crushing assault of the Soviet Red Army. Streets that once echoed with parades of victory were now littered with bodies, the air thick with smoke, the cries of the wounded carried through avenues that had collapsed into rubble. For the people of Berlin, there was no refuge. Each day brought new terror from the sky. Allied bombers tore apart entire districts, reducing cathedrals, schools, and theaters into ash. Civilians huddled in basements and subway tunnels, where water seeped from broken pipes and the stench of death mixed with the choking fumes of gunpowder. Hunger gnawed at them, bread had vanished, water was scarce, and children scavenged for scraps in the ruins of their own neighborhoods. And still, the bombardment grew worse. On April 16, the Soviets launched their final assault. The Battle of Berlin. 1 million men, thousands of tanks, and endless artillery descended upon the capital. Day and night, the horizon glowed red, the ground shook, and the sound of war became unbroken. For those who survived in the ruins, despair was absolute. Berliners whispered in the dark about what awaited them if the Soviets broke through, stories of vengeance, of retribution for the atrocities Germany had inflicted on the East. Fear spread like a second fire, consuming whatever courage starvation had not already stripped away. And at the center of it all, Adolf Hitler had vanished from the world above. He would not walk the ruined streets or share in the suffering of his people. By mid-January, he had permanently retreated underground, into the labyrinth of concrete chambers known as the Führerbunker. Above ground, an empire was collapsing into chaos. Below ground, a dictator surrounded himself with silence, shadows, and the last remnants of loyalty. The fate of millions would now be decided in rooms without windows. Beneath the gardens of the Reich Chancellery, sealed behind iron doors and walls of reinforced concrete, lay the Führerbunker, Hitler's final sanctuary, and his final prison. It was not grand. It was not majestic. It was claustrophobic. Narrow corridors, ceilings low enough to press down on the spirit, rooms barely large enough for a desk and a bed. The air was heavy with damp, the walls sweating from constant water seepage. Ventilation fans hummed endlessly, pushing stale oxygen through the underground maze. Day and night blurred together. Those inside lost all sense of time. The bunker had 2 levels. The upper served as offices and storage, while the lower, 30 feet deeper, housed Hitler's private quarters. Here was his bedroom, sparsely furnished with a simple iron bed, a table, and a map-covered wall. Adjacent, Eva Braun's chamber, decorated with the feminine touches of a woman clinging to normalcy. A few photographs, cosmetics laid out carefully, as though the world above were not collapsing. Every morning and evening, staff and generals were summoned to the small briefing room, where Hitler bent over his maps. By now, those maps bore little resemblance to reality. Divisions he ordered into action had been annihilated weeks earlier. His trembling hand traced lines that no longer existed, while his voice, hoarse and broken, demanded counterattacks from armies that were ghosts. For those who lived alongside him, the atmosphere was suffocating. They saw the change in him clearly. The stooped figure, his body shaking with the tremors of Parkinson's disease. His left hand often pressed tight against his side to control its shaking. His once powerful voice now cracked with weakness. Hitler's doctor, Theodor Morell, supplied him with an endless regimen of pills and injections. Vitamins, narcotics, stimulants, a cocktail meant to sustain a man who was already collapsing. Without them, Hitler grew listless and irritable. With them, he lurched between bursts of manic energy and crushing fatigue. The staff whispered among themselves. They could smell decay in the air, not only of the bunker itself, but of the regime it sheltered. Outside, the Reich was burning. Inside, the Führer clung to delusions, surrounded by loyalists too afraid to confront the truth. It was here, in this suffocating underworld, that the last act of the Third Reich would play out. And it was here that Eva Braun, the woman Hitler had hidden for so long, chose to remain, determined that if the Reich was to die, she would die with it. In the final weeks of the Reich, as shells thundered above and concrete dust drifted through the air below, Eva Braun began to write. Her letters were not to Adolf Hitler, he was close enough for whispered words. Instead, they were to her family and closest friends, fragments of farewells smuggled from the depths of the Führerbunker. They are among the few surviving windows into those sealed rooms, and they reveal a devotion that was both chilling and tragic. On April 19, the eve of Hitler's 56th birthday, Eva took up her pen. Her words carried the weight of finality. I have practiced with pistols. I am resolved to stay here to the end. Do not think badly of me. My life has no meaning without him. There was no hesitation in her tone, no plea for rescue. She wrote as one already resigned to death, bound not by ideology, but by loyalty to the man at her side. Her letter describes the strange rhythm of life in the bunker. The briefings that echoed through the halls. The endless waiting between air raid sirens. The pale light of bulbs that never dimmed, robbing the inhabitants of night and day. She even noted Hitler's stubborn optimism, his belief that armies under General Steiner might yet deliver salvation, even as Soviet artillery drew closer by the hour. To her, this was not madness. It was love. A devotion that elevated delusion to destiny. She dressed carefully each day, as if preparing for a dinner party rather than an apocalypse. She laughed with the secretaries, encouraged the guards, and projected a calmness that unsettled even those who had already given up hope. The letters, though tender, read like vows spoken before the grave. They are filled with small tokens, requests for jewelry to be sent to Bavaria, reassurances to family that she had no fear, only conviction. Eva Braun was not a politician, nor a soldier. She held no power in the Reich. Yet in these letters, she carved herself a place in its last chapter. She would not be remembered as the Führer's hidden mistress. She would be remembered as the woman who chose to die beside him, even as the world they had built dissolved into ash. April 20th, 1945. Adolf Hitler's 56th birthday. Above ground, Berlin was collapsing. Soviet artillery pounded the suburbs, shaking the city with relentless force. Civilians cowered in cellars. Entire districts had vanished into rubble and flame. The Reich, once spread across Europe, was now reduced to a besieged capital. Yet in the Reich Chancellery Garden, beneath a sky choked with smoke, a strange spectacle unfolded. For the last time, Adolf Hitler emerged into the open air. He was a shadow of the dictator who had once commanded armies and nations. His frame hunched, his left hand trembling uncontrollably, his face drawn and ashen. His steps were slow, faltering. Witnesses noted he looked decades older than his years. Waiting for him were a group of Hitler youth, boys no older than 14, some barely strong enough to hold the Panzerfaust slung over their shoulders. They had been brought to the Chancellery as symbols of loyalty and sacrifice. One by one, Hitler shook their hands. His voice was weak, his movements stiff. For the cameras, it was staged as a gesture of defiance, the Führer honoring the last defenders of the Reich. In truth, it was a farewell. Inside the bunker, a macabre celebration was arranged. Senior Nazis and SS officers filed into Hitler's quarters to offer congratulations. There were no speeches of triumph, no joy, only hollow words, masks of loyalty covering faces already resigned to defeat. It was a grotesque parody of the grand rallies of Nuremberg, a birthday party held in the tomb of a regime. Eva Braun marked the occasion with a gift, a signed photograph of herself, inscribed simply, "To my Führer, from your faithful Eva." She had waited years for recognition, years spent in the shadows. Yet even now, Hitler refused to publicly acknowledge her as his partner. She was present, adored him in silence, but to the outside world she remained invisible. In that room, Hitler's generals and ministers offered their well-rehearsed gestures of loyalty. But behind the scenes, doubts festered. Rumors swirled that Göring and Himmler were already plotting their escape, perhaps even their succession. The Reich that had once demanded absolute obedience was beginning to fracture from within. For Berlin, the day ended like every other in April 1945, under fire, under siege, under ruin. For Adolf Hitler, it was his last birthday. A day that revealed not strength, but frailty. Not unity, but decay. In that brief appearance in the garden, the world saw the truth. The dictator who had plunged Europe into war was now a trembling, broken man, shaking hands with children he would send to die. In April 1945, as the Red Army pressed closer to Berlin, many of Hitler's advisors begged him to leave. There were still options, at least in theory. The Nazi High Command spoke of the Alpenfestung, the Alpine fortress in southern Germany, a last redoubt in the Bavarian Alps. There, loyal SS units could gather, a final government could be formed, and Hitler could continue the war as a phantom leader, safe behind mountains and loyal divisions. The propaganda machine even spread the myth of impregnable fortresses carved into the Alps, bunkers stocked with weapons and supplies, armies waiting for the final stand. But it was only a myth. Intelligence reports showed there was no fortress, no armies massed in the mountains. The so-called Alpine redoubt was nothing but rumor and illusion. Hitler knew this. And still, he refused to leave Berlin. He told those around him that he would never flee the capital. To abandon Berlin, he said, would be to abandon the Reich itself. In his mind, his fate was tied to the fate of the city. If Berlin fell, he would fall with it. Privately, he spoke in terms drawn from Wagner, of Götterdämmerung, the twilight of the gods. Just as in the operas he adored, he imagined his own end as a grand finale. A world set ablaze, enemies triumphant, but the leader remaining until the last curtain fell. It was not strategy. It was theater. Joseph Goebbels, the Reich's propaganda minister, reinforced this vision. He whispered to Hitler that to remain in Berlin would be to achieve immortality, to become the martyr of a collapsing empire. Goebbels, fanatical to the end, was already preparing to follow Hitler into death. Others disagreed. Some staff begged him to retreat to the Berghof, his mountain residence in Bavaria. There, they argued, he might regroup. Even Eva Braun, loyal though she was, reminded him that escape was possible. But Hitler dismissed it. He scoffed at the idea of hiding in luxury while Berlin was destroyed around him. His decision was absolute, he would stay. This choice sealed not only his own fate, but that of everyone in the bunker. Officers, secretaries, guards, and even Eva Braun, all of them became prisoners of a man determined to script his own destruction. Above ground, the capital continued to burn. Below, in the Führerbunker, Hitler began to speak of death with a strange calm. He told his staff he would never be captured alive. He recalled Mussolini's fate, the dictator's body strung up by partisans in Milan, spat on by the crowd. He would not suffer the same humiliation. In those moments, the future was clear. There would be no Alpine fortress, no escape flight to safety, no surrender. Only Berlin, the bunker, and the end. The die had been cast. Adolf Hitler had chosen his tomb. On April 21, 1945, the Red Army began shelling Berlin directly. For the men and women trapped in the Führerbunker, the sound was constant, deafening. Each blast rattled the walls, shaking dust from the ceilings, making the dim electric bulbs flicker. The end was no longer a distant threat. It was above them, outside their walls, tearing the city apart street by street. Hitler, however, clung to fantasy. Each morning and evening, he gathered his generals in the map room. His trembling hand traced impossible maneuvers across charts that bore little resemblance to reality. He spoke of General Felix Steiner leading an order stripping Göring of all offices and demanding his resignation. The man who had once commanded the Luftwaffe, who had stood beside Hitler in the early days of the Nazi rise to power, was now branded a traitor. But Hitler did not stop there. In his fury, he ordered Göring's arrest. Bormann, ever ruthless, went further still. He instructed SS units to execute Göring once Berlin had fallen. The order was never carried out, but the intent was clear. Word of Göring's fall spread quickly through the bunker. For those trapped within its walls, it confirmed what they had already sensed: loyalty no longer mattered. Paranoia ruled, and betrayal was everywhere. The once mighty leaders of the Reich were now fractured, turning on each other in desperation. Göring, once second only to Hitler, was finished. His fall was not just the collapse of a man, but the collapse of the Reich's hierarchy itself. To those listening in the bunker corridors, the message was unmistakable: if Göring could be cast aside as a traitor, no one was safe. Heinrich Himmler was the most feared man in the Reich after Hitler, architect of the SS state, master of the camps, the man who turned ideology into machinery. In April 1945, as Berlin burned and the bunker groaned under artillery, he made his move, not toward Berlin, but away from it. While Hitler clung to maps in the underground war room, Himmler slipped into the north, moving between Hohenlohe and Lübeck, insulated by SS escorts and the fiction that he might salvage a future from the ruins. He had convinced himself of two things: that the Western Allies hated Bolshevism more than Nazism, and that he, not Hitler, could be the man to bargain Germany out of total collapse. The channel he chose was neutral Sweden. Count Folke Bernadotte of the Swedish Red Cross, already known to Himmler for the white buses evacuations that had pried prisoners from camps in the war's last weeks. Meetings followed. In guarded rooms, with the war's thunder rolling over northern Germany, Himmler floated his offer: Germany would surrender to the British and Americans in the West and continue fighting the Soviets in the East. He spoke not as a supplicant, but as a would-be statesman, imagining that the Allies would accept the SS chief as a partner against Moscow. They did not. The Western Allies demanded unconditional surrender, to East and West alike. No separate peace. No deals with the SS. Still, Himmler pressed. He authorized gestures meant to look humane, releases of prisoners, promises of order, and believed these would soften Allied resolve. He misread the moment. Even as Berlin's civilians starved and burned, he imagined an afterlife for his power. On April 28, the illusion detonated in the bunker. From Stockholm came the broadcast. International news wires reported that Heinrich Himmler had offered Germany's surrender to the Western Allies. In the Führerbunker, Joseph Goebbels brought the report to Hitler. The room chilled. Then came the fury. Hitler's face tightened, his voice, already ragged from weeks of strain, broke into rage. Himmler. The man he had trusted with the SS, the man he had allowed to build a second state within the state, now negotiating behind his back, and on the very day Soviet artillery reached the heart of Berlin. If Göring's telegram had felt like a coup, Himmler's gambit felt like treason from the soul of the regime itself. Orders snapped out through clenched teeth. Himmler was stripped of all offices and ranks. His name, once inseparable from the Reich's Iron Core, was spat out as Verräter, traitor. Arrest warrants followed. In the political testament Hitler would dictate the next day, Himmler's name would be recorded in contempt for posterity. The shock ricocheted through the bunker corridors. If Himmler could turn, then nothing inside or outside those concrete walls was stable. Paranoia hardened into iron. Whispers grew shorter. Eyes avoided one another. There was, too, the matter of the SS liaison in the Chancellery, Hermann Fegelein, Himmler's representative and Eva Braun's brother-in-law. He had vanished from his post as the city fell. Security men found him in a West Berlin apartment, dressed in civilian clothes, drunk, surrounded by cash and jewelry, preparing to flee. Hauled back to the Chancellery, he failed even the minimal tests of loyalty. After a summary court-martial, he was taken into the garden. Shots followed. In the bunker, The message was unmistakable: desertion and betrayal would be washed away in blood. Accounts differ on the exact sequence of Fegeline's last hours, but his death in the chancellery precincts was the closing of a door no one inside could reopen. With Göring denounced and Himmler cast out, Hitler looked around his shrinking circle and saw only endings: a city in ashes, a map room of ghosts, and a regime devouring itself. The betrayals did not change the outcome of the war, they changed the atmosphere in the bunker, from dread to fatalism. Above ground, the Red Army tightened its grip. Below, the Reich's most terrible servant had tried to bargain with the future and instead accelerated the collapse. The bunker air grew heavier. The end, once a possibility, became a schedule. In the early hours of April 29, 1945, deep beneath the ruins of Berlin, Adolf Hitler staged a ceremony that he had denied Eva Braun for more than a decade. At midnight, in the dim light of the bunker corridors, the dictator finally agreed to marry the woman who had chosen to share his fate. The witnesses were a handful of loyal staff: Joseph Goebbels, Martin Bormann, and a registrar summoned from the city above. The registrar, Walter Wagner, had come through a city in flames to perform his duty. He found himself in a world of shadows and whispers, standing before a man whose name was already being carved into history as its darkest villain. The bride appeared in a black silk dress. Eva Braun, 33 years old, calm and composed, smiled as she signed her name for the last time as Fräulein. Then she became Frau Hitler, a title she had long desired, though it would last for less than 40 hours. She clutched a bouquet of white flowers, her voice steady as she took her vows. Hitler, frail and trembling, signed his name with a hand that shook so violently he pressed his arm against the table to steady it. Those present recalled a moment of silence afterward, broken only by the sound of artillery outside. For a brief instant, in that suffocating bunker, it felt as though time had stopped. After the ceremony, champagne was poured. The newlyweds hosted a small gathering in Hitler's quarters. Eva laughed, toasted the staff, even danced with officers in the cramped space. It was grotesque, a wedding celebration inside a tomb, as the Reich itself collapsed above their heads. Yet for her, it was a moment of triumph. After years of secrecy and shadows, she was finally acknowledged as his wife. But the celebration was brief. At around 4 a.m., Hitler withdrew to dictate what he called his political testament. Two secretaries, Traudl Junge and Gerda Christian, took his words as he paced the floor. The document revealed a mind trapped in obsessions, even at the threshold of death. He still railed against the Jews, still blamed his generals for betrayal, still justified a war that had left Europe in ruins. He refused responsibility for the destruction, casting blame in every direction but his own. Yet there were revelations too. He formally expelled Hermann Göring and Heinrich Himmler from the party, branding them traitors. He named Admiral Karl Donitz as his successor, ensuring that the war, though lost, would continue without him. Then came his personal will. He left what remained of his possessions, largely symbolic by then, to the party and to his family. But more than property, he left behind an image of himself that he wanted history to remember, a man who had refused to flee, who had chosen death over surrender. When the documents were finished, typed, and signed, couriers were dispatched through the burning city to carry them out. Few would make it. Some were captured by the Soviets, others by the Allies. These pages would become central to the myth-making of the post-war years. Inside the bunker, the mood shifted. The marriage and the testament were not acts of renewal. They were acts of closure. Hitler had tied up his life like a ledger, closing accounts, leaving nothing undone. The staff understood what it meant. The Führer was preparing for his end. And now, by binding Eva Braun to him as wife, he had ensured she would follow him into death. April 30th, 1945. Morning broke as a vibration in concrete, the Red Army's artillery walking closer through the ruins of Berlin. In the Führerbunker, clocks meant little. There was only the rhythm of briefings, the hum of ventilation, the fine dust that never settled. Hitler rose late, gray-faced, shoulders caved, the tremor in his left hand now constant. Reports from the front were no longer reports, they were confirmations of defeat. General Hans Krebs could offer nothing but fragments, no relief from Wenck, no attack from Steiner, no line to hold. Berlin was an island being swallowed, building by building. Hitler ate a sparse meal with a handful of staff. He spoke quietly, almost conversationally, about what was to come. There would be no capture. He would not be paraded, strung up, humiliated. He repeated the instruction that had become a refrain. When the end came, his body must be burned immediately. Gasoline would be needed, a great deal of it. The order was passed to his adjutant Otto Gunsch and his valet Heinz Ling. His driver Erich Kempka was told to find fuel in a city where fuel no longer existed. Before noon, the bunker saw small, private farewells. Secretaries Traudl Junge and Gerda Christian were called in, thanked for their service, each given a cyanide vial, for their own use, should they choose it. The gesture was chilling in its calm, a leader handing out deaths like rations. Hitler's gaze moved past them as if already looking into a different room, a different hour. In the kennel, the Alsatian blondie lay her head in a handler's lap for the last time. On Hitler's order, a cyanide capsule was tested on the dog. She died within moments. In the narrow corridor, the news passed in whispers, a final proof that the capsules would do what was intended. Sometime after 1 in the afternoon, Hitler and Eva Braun took a last, slow circuit through the inner rooms. Eva wore a dark dress, her hair and makeup were immaculate, as if for a dinner party that would never begin. They paused with Goebbels, with Bormann, with the secretaries, the guards. Hands were shaken, goodbye murmured, eyes briefly met and then dropped. Eva smiled, almost brightly. Hitler's voice was low and level. He asked that the staff try to escape that night, to break out westward if they could. He did not expect to see them again. Shortly after 3 o'clock, they withdrew to Hitler's private sitting room, a small space with a low couch pushed against the wall, an end table set with a few personal things. Outside the door, Ling and Gunsch took their posts. The corridor held its breath. Minutes passed, 10, perhaps 15. The sound that followed was small for an event that would end an empire, a single, sharp report, deadened by concrete. When Ling and Bormann entered, the smell of bitter almonds rolled out into the hall. Eva Braun lay slumped on the sofa, legs tucked slightly to the side, a thin ribbon of foam at the lips. Cyanide, swift and absolute. Beside her, Adolf Hitler sat with his head pitched forward, blood soaking the right armrest and pooling on the floor. The Walther pistol rested near his foot. He had chosen certainty, poison and a shot to the head. In that cramped room, the Third Reich finally died. There was no time for ceremony. Gun Shenling wrapped the bodies in blankets and carried them up the concrete stairs to the emergency exit, into the blasted garden of the Reich Chancellery. Shells were falling close enough to throw up earth. Kempka arrived with cans of petrol scavenged from wrecked vehicles. The bodies were placed in a shallow shell crater near a patch of broken paving, doused until the air stung the lungs, and set alight. Goebbels, Bormann, and a small circle stood back, raised their arms in a final salute, and watched the flames take hold. The fire, under shell burst and cold wind, burned unevenly. More fuel was fetched, the pyre reignited again and again through the afternoon until only charred shapes remained. Underground, doors closed. Papers were gathered. The government that Hitler had named in his testament existed only on stationery. Above, dusk drew its veil over the Chancellery garden, the smell of petrol and scorched cloth drifting down the bunker stairwell. Night brought another ritual of endings. Joseph and Magda Goebbels had decided they would not live in a world without National Socialism. Their 6 children, Helga, Hildegard, Helmut, Holdine, Hedwig, Heidrun, slept in an adjacent room, the walls painted with cheerful murals from a life that no longer existed. A physician from the bunker staff administered morphine to bring the children deeper into sleep. What followed was wordless and terrible. Cyanide ampoules were crushed. Little mouths were opened. History fell silent in that room, only breathing and then not breathing marked the passage. On May 1st, the Goebbelses walked into the garden in their overcoats. They found a spot near the place where Hitler and Eva had burned. Magda took poison. Joseph either followed with a capsule and a pistol or was helped by an SS orderly. Accounts diverge in the chaos, but in moments they lay together on the ground. Fuel was poured again. Another brief, inadequate fire guttered and went out in the wind. Below, the bunker breathed a last, shallow breath. Martin Bormann arranged for a breakout that night. Krebs would attempt a useless parley with the Soviets. The remaining staff burned what was left to burn, packed what could be carried, and listened to the artillery walk nearer until even the earth seemed to vibrate without pause. By then, the events of April 30th had already begun to escape the bunker's control. Above ground, flames had reduced the bodies to unrecognizable remains, scattered by shell bursts and shovels as men tried to cover their traces. The instructions had been obeyed, erase every trace, but the ground itself remembered, and the men who watched could not forget. The Reich, born in parade ground thunder and floodlit spectacle, ended in a private room, a small gunshot, the taste of poison, and 2 fires fighting wind and shell in a ruined garden. In the space between those moments, between the door closing and the flame catching, the 20th century pivoted. The bunker fell quiet. Only the ventilation hummed, and the city above answered with fire. By the dawn of May 2, 1945, the guns had fallen silent over Berlin. The Red Army had crushed the last defenses. German officers emerged into daylight with white flags, their faces hollow, their city reduced to ash. The Reich's capital had ceased to exist. Deep beneath the ruins, the Führerbunker stood abandoned. Its corridors reeked of smoke, decay, and defeat. Soviet troops forced their way inside, weapons ready for the last fanatics. But they found only the wreckage of offices, smoldering paper, and a handful of dazed survivors. Then came the search for Hitler. In the Chancellery garden, the Soviets uncovered the charred remains from the shell crater. 2 bodies, burned almost beyond recognition, lay among the rubble. Nearby, The remains of Joseph and Magda Goebbels were discovered, alongside the bodies of their 6 children inside the bunker, a sight so haunting that even hardened Soviet soldiers paused in silence. Forensic teams gathered what they could. Among the ashes, fragments of skull, jawbone, and teeth were recovered. German staff dentists were brought in under interrogation, confirming the dental work as Hitler's. Eva Braun's remains were likewise identified by witnesses. The evidence was clear: Adolf Hitler and his wife were dead. And yet, the truth was not made public. Joseph Stalin ordered secrecy. He feared that admitting Hitler's death would allow the West to claim credit for ending the war. Worse, he saw advantage in keeping the world guessing. Soviet reports were contradictory by design. In some, Hitler had died a coward by poison; in others, he had escaped in disguise. Even Soviet officers on the ground were kept in the dark, their findings locked away in classified files. As the Cold War dawned, this silence fed a fire of rumor. Across Europe and America, whispers spread that Hitler had fled in a submarine to South America, that he lived in Argentina or Paraguay, that he hid in the shadows of Spain. Books and newspapers seized on the mystery, twisting the bunker's claustrophobic truth into endless conspiracy. Meanwhile, in Berlin, the Soviets plundered the Chancellery ruins, dragging away evidence. Diaries, fragments of letters, and testimonies were boxed and buried in Moscow's archives, unseen for decades. It was in these files, years later, that men like French Commandant Raymond Rose uncovered fragments of Eva Braun's last letters, drafts of Hitler's will, and eyewitness statements long hidden from the world. The world above had moved on, but beneath the surface, the story of Hitler's final days remained distorted by secrecy. The dictator who had burned his own body to deny history left behind something more powerful than remains: uncertainty. And in that uncertainty, a myth was born. The Führerbunker did not stand as a monument. It was buried. In the years after the war, Soviet engineers demolished the Reich Chancellery, filled in the craters, and sealed the underground passages. The entrances were blocked, the walls collapsed, the site paved over. By the 1980s, what remained of the bunker lay hidden beneath drab apartment blocks and a parking lot in East Berlin. There was no plaque, no marker, no sign that beneath the asphalt lay the rooms where Hitler's empire had died. For the Soviets, erasure was deliberate. They feared the site would become a shrine for neo-Nazis, a pilgrimage point for those still enthralled by the myth of the Führer. To them, silence was safer than memory. Yet secrecy only deepened speculation. In the absence of official truth, myths flourished. Conspiracy theorists claimed Hitler had fled by submarine to Argentina, or to a fortress in the Andes, or even to the Middle East. Others argued that a body had never been found, that the Soviets had fabricated evidence, that Hitler still walked in shadows. The reality was far less dramatic, and far more human. Hitler had died in a concrete room, by his own hand, leaving behind a wife who shared his fate, ministers who poisoned their children, and followers who scattered into the ruins of a dead city. But because Stalin suppressed the evidence, the world was left to wonder. Decades later, fragments emerged from sealed archives. Among them were Eva Braun's final letters, Hitler's political testament, and witness accounts preserved by the Soviets. In the hands of researchers like French Commandant Raymond Rose, these documents revealed the claustrophobic atmosphere of those last days. The betrayals of Göring and Himmler, the blind devotion of Eva Braun, the madness of a leader issuing phantom orders to armies that no longer existed. They showed us not the mystery of an escape, but the certainty of a collapse. They gave voice to the whispers of those trapped beneath the Reich chancellery as the world above turned to fire. The Führerbunker itself is gone, erased from the map, paved over, its walls crumbling in the soil beneath modern Berlin. Yet its legacy remains etched into history. It was not a fortress of triumph, but a tomb of delusion. A place where a dictator, once worshipped by millions, ended his life alone, betrayed, and broken. And in its silence, the bunker continues to speak. It tells us how absolute power ends, not with glory, but with paranoia, cowardice, and ruin. This was Hitler's last secret. And this was the final day of the Third Reich.